Okay, next slide. Before I get into the details, I just want to note that without voter approved Measure D, most of the 18 miles of trail segments that are currently in pre-construction or construction phase would not be moving forward. And the additional 12 miles of coastal rail trail that are now being entering the pre-construction phase as part of the zero emission rail and trail project wouldn't be advancing without the voter approved Measure D funds, which provides us a mechanism to leverage those state and federal funds. RTC and its partner agencies are now able to deliver many more projects of this magnitude with Measure D because it serves as this important match, and that can't be underestimated. It also can provide a tool for filling the funding gaps to deliver these desirable projects. So this table, I'm going to walk you through it. It's also in the staff report. If folks are having trouble seeing it, they can look online. It provides information about different scenarios for programming Measure D active transportation category funds. So this considers all of the eligible expenses that could be the Measure D active transportation category funds could be used for. So the column on the far left starts with those active transportation program category revenues, that first row. These revenue estimates are updated at a minimum annually. Recent projects adopted, the recent estimates were adopted by the RTC at its April 2024 meeting. It assumed 170.3 million in revenues over the life of the Measure D active transportation category, plus 3 million in revenues for a total of 174 million, which you see in the first row of this table. RTC does have the authority to bond against Measure D revenues, so you will see bonding listed as an eligible expense and bond proceeds as the second row. Bonding is a way to advance the Measure D funds if projects are ready to be delivered prior to funds being received by the RTC. And RTC is fortunate to be in a position that it has projects that are ready to be to be delivered earlier in the 30-year Measure D sales tax measure rather than later on, so that the community can experience those benefits sooner. Also listed on the next row are the previously programmed active transportation funds through fiscal year 27-28, which includes funds programmed in the current 5-year plan. And this amounts to 63 million. It also includes the next row, the estimated cost increases for segments 8 through 11. I've already mentioned the 27 to 28 million that are estimated in funding gap that is currently estimated for segments 10 and 11. We've also been made aware by the City of Santa Cruz there's a funding gap for their project at approximately 16 million. So that 43 million assumes the funding gap for both of those projects based on cost estimates. I do want to note that segment 8 and 9 is approaching 65% design, and that they will have updated cost estimates at around the July timeframe, and we can return to the commission with that information when it's available. The next row addresses trail maintenance as an eligible Measure D transportation, active transportation expenditure. RTC has already programmed trail maintenance funds to segment 5, the North Coast Rail Trail, also known as the North Coast Rail Trail. Some funds to segment 7 in the City of Santa Cruz and to segment 18 in the City of Santa Cruz. And all of those are included in the 5-year plan. In addition to those trail maintenance fund, RTC could consider programming additional funds to future trail segments. This was discussed in detail at the RTC September 2023 meeting, which was actually also held here in the City of Watsonville. Should RTC assume the cost of trail maintenance for future segments, staff, that would reduce the available Measure D active revenues, active transportation revenues available for capital projects by about $30 million. A rail corridor maintenance is also an eligible expense under the Measure D active transportation corridor category. It's averaged about 1.2 million per year, and the estimates here assume that it continues over the life of Measure D with about a 3.5% escalation. These costs could be reduced as RTC seeks state and federal funds to construct passenger rail and streamline repair and environmental permitting, but the is assumed here in the absence of that information. So the remaining Measure D capacity for each scenario that I'll talk you through is provided in this last row here for your informational purposes. Staff is not recommending programming any Measure D active transportation funds today, but we prepared this information for your discussion. So now that I've reviewed the eligible expenses that I'm going to be noting in each of these scenarios, I'll talk through each of the scenarios briefly. Scenario 1 shows the current projected, so we're looking at that column that says approved funding, the second column from the right. And that shows you the current projected revenues, what we assumed as the bond proceeds prior to the updated cost estimates for segments 8 through 11, as well as the previously programmed funds and the debt service on the bond revenues that we previously assumed. And it shows you a balance in that scenario of 97 million in Measure D active transportation category funds. Scenario 2 describes it adds to that, the scenario 1, the cost of fully funding segments 8 through 11 funding gap with Measure D active transportation resources. Like as mentioned before, staff expects that cost reduction strategies and future grant awards will fill some of the funding gap, but may not fill all of it. So for informational purpose, we went ahead and produced a scenario under which you could see if RTC was to fully fund the funding gap with Measure D revenues. And you can see that reduces the available Measure D active transportation category funds to 15 million. Scenario 3 provides information if you add in the future corridor maintenance, and all of those future corridor maintenance costs are realized. So there's an additional 36 million that would be needed from Measure D active transportation category should the commission choose to fund rail maintenance with that Measure D active transportation revenues, excuse me. And then finally, scenario 4 gives you an idea of what would happen to the available capacity if you then added in trail maintenance for all of the segments going forward with an addition of expenditure of 30 million. And it shows you that the RTC Measure D active transportation capacity is insufficient. So the actual request and programming of Measure D funds to meet all of these will likely be somewhere in the middle of these requests. So these are just for information purposes, and it doesn't consider any other cost increases on projects for which the project sponsors will request Measure D active transportation funding. I do want to just take the opportunity right now to let folks know something about segment 5, because it was reported in the director's report last month, April 4th, that there had been identified a funding gap for the mitigation portion of segment 5. Although the engineer's estimates for construction came in the bids came in below the engineer's estimates. RTC has been working with the segment 5 team at Federal Highways. We think the mitigation costs will come down significantly upon more review of the cost estimates, and Federal Highways is going to go ahead and award the construction contract next week based on RTC's existing funding agreement with them, which would require RTC to cover just around 24% of any cost increases on the project. We do have some contingency already built into Measure D, but I mention this because as RTC has funding agreements with local jurisdictions for projects and they experience cost increases, that will also need to be considered moving forward. Okay, next slide, please. So before closing my presentation, I know I've provided a lot of information here. I do want to briefly walk through the environmental review for segments 10 and 11 and RTC's role as the responsible agency in this project. Let's see, I want to also remind people what the purpose of CEQA is. I think it's important for people to remember that it's a really important process for evaluating, disclosing the potential environmental impacts of the project. It's used to inform decision makers and the public about potential significant environmental impacts. It identifies ways that environmental damage can be avoided or reduced, and explains to the public the reasons why decisions are made, even if significant impacts occur. The environmental review and certification and acceptance of the EIR is not an approval of the project. And we saw that last month at the County Board of Supervisors, where they did certify the final EIR, but they did not approve a specific project. Next slide, please. So any of RTC's action today would be on the help to move to complete the project approval and environmental phase of the segment 10 and 11 project. And RTC is the responsible agency under CEQA. And that's the city. Oh, dang. Should say the County of Santa Cruz is the lead agency. And these, I'm sorry, this slide wasn't, the updated slide didn't make it in there. The dates down here are incorrect. So let me just state the correct dates. So this was the lead agency for segment 10 and 11 is the County of Santa Cruz, and the public review period was October 15th through December 16th, 2023. And the certified EIR, as I mentioned, was considered by the County of Santa Cruz on March 26th. As the responsible agency, RTC has discretionary approval of the proposed project and considers the adequacy of the certified document, but does not certify the document itself. But the RTC will make necessary findings and the statements of overriding considerations. And I'll talk a little bit about that next. Next slide, please. Okay, so as part of the environmental process, 3 significant and unavoidable impacts were identified to result from the segment 10 and 11 project. These are related to the aesthetics, the biological resources, and the greenhouse gas emissions. These are all related to the tree removal that's associated with the project and result in these significant and unavoidable impacts. Next slide, please. So when a lead agency or a responsible agency accepts an EIR, it must consider the findings regarding the impacts that are significant. So it can be the significant and unavoidable impacts that I just mentioned, as well as the significant impacts that can be reduced to less than significant with mitigation. These findings are important because they explain why the impacts are found to be significant and found to be reduced to less than significant or unavoidable. So it discloses that information to the public and decision makers. And these are described and included in your packet as Exhibit A to Attachment 3. Also, the statement of overriding considerations are important for you to be familiar with. They explain why beneficial aspects of the proposed project outweigh the unavoidable adverse environmental impacts and why the agency is willing to accept these adverse impacts. This involves RTC making a judgment that the project and its benefits outweigh those unavoidable significant impacts. So today, staff recommends that RTC accept the coastal rail trail segments 10 and 11 final impact report as adequate for decision making and adopt findings, overriding considerations, and the mitigation monitoring and reporting program for coastal rail trail segments 10 and 11, ultimate trail configuration, as well as the optional first phase, and to file a notice of determination for the project in its entirety. Next slide. So really the next steps to continue to move this project forward is for the County of Santa Cruz, or should it be desirable, the RTC, to enter a baseline agreement with Caltrans so they can seek funding allocation for final design from the California Transportation Commission, as well for RTC staff and the County of Santa Cruz to move forward to fill that funding gap and to reduce project costs. And that concludes my report. I think the next slide does list the staff recommendations for your reference.